The sun hung low over Rusted Hollow, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. A cold wind swept through, carrying the smell of dry earth and wood smoke. Mara Lee stepped off the rickety stagecoach, her boots crunching on the gravel. She tightened the scarf around her neck, pulling it just under her jaw, as if it could keep the past from following her. Her eyes darted to every alley, every corner. She didn't look up, didn't smile. Only the wind dared brush against her face. The town seemed almost empty. A horse whinnied somewhere behind a closed stable. The sound made her stiffen, and her hand drifted to the strap of her bag. Mara moved quickly, her coat flaring behind her, dust kicking up at her heels. She paused only once, glancing at the sun sinking behind the hills. Rusted Hollow was a rough place, she knew that. She had chosen it because no one would know her. After all, she could disappear into the shadows. A sudden movement caught her eye. A man, broad-shouldered and tall, walked along the other side of the street. Jonas Creed. His boots made soft, deliberate sounds against the dirt. He didn't speak, didn't smile. He just watched. Mara noticed his presence immediately, though she didn't turn to him. There was something in the way he moved, a calm that didn't belong in a town like this. She stopped at the edge of the boardwalk, pulling her bag tighter to her chest. Jonas slowed too, keeping his distance, his eyes on her without ever blinking. Mara whispered, more to herself than to anyone, "Don't touch me. I'm not your wife." Jonas didn't answer at once. He didn't need to. His gaze was steady, patient, and somehow understanding. After a pause, he said quietly, "Then I'll wait until you are." The words didn't feel like a promise or a threat. They felt like a question she could answer in her own time. Mara's heart skipped, but she didn't look at him. She just kept walking, letting the wind whip her coat and hair around her. She found a small inn at the far end of the street. Its sign creaked in the wind, swinging like a slow pendulum. Mara pushed the door open, and a bell rang, jangling through the empty room. Inside, the air was warmer, scented with old wood and something faintly sweet, baking bread, maybe, or coffee. She stepped to the counter, running her fingers over the smooth wood as if it could anchor her to something safe. The innkeeper looked up, eyebrows raised. "New in town?" Mara nodded once. She didn't give her name. She never gave her name. The innkeeper glanced at the empty street outside. "Rough place, Rusted Hollow. Keep to yourself." Mara didn't answer. She moved to a room at the back, dragging her bag behind her. She set it down, brushing dust from her coat. The window overlooked the main street. She stared at the horizon, at the sun dipping below the hills. Somewhere, a horse neighed again, and the wind carried it across the town. Outside, Jonas lingered at the edge of the street. He watched the inn, watched the shadow of Mara through the window. The wind tugged at his coat, and he adjusted his hat. He didn't move closer. Not yet. He waited. The street was quiet again, but the tension in the air felt like it could snap at any moment. Mara leaned against the wall, letting the silence sink in. For the first time in weeks, she felt the weight of the past pressing down, yet also the pull of something uncertain, something cautious. She didn't trust it. She didn't trust him. Not yet. But the way he waited, it was different. The wind rattled the inn sign outside, carrying dust across the empty street. Mara turned from the window, her reflection sharp in the glass, and sat on the edge of the bed. She tucked her feet under her and let the quiet settle around her, the sun vanishing behind the hills. Outside, Jonas disappeared down the street, moving like a shadow, patient, watchful, waiting for a reason to step closer. The last light fell on Rusted Hollow, leaving long shapes and deep shadows, and the town seemed to hold its breath. The next morning, Rusted Hollow woke slowly. Dust swirled along the empty street, catching the weak light of sunrise. Mara stood by the window of her small room, watching the town come alive. A wagon creaked down the boardwalk, a dog barked, and a man shouted from somewhere near the saloon. She pulled her scarf tighter, as if wrapping herself could keep the world from touching her. She had no plan for the town, no friends, no allies. All she carried was the weight of her past and the sharp memory of men who thought her life could be controlled. She had learned long ago to be careful, to trust no one, to move quickly and silently. But even in the early light, she felt eyes on her. She turned, expecting someone in the doorway, but the room was empty. Only the sound of her own heartbeat filled the space. Outside, Jonas Creed had already begun his day. He walked down the street with a calm purpose, boots thudding on the wooden planks. He didn't hurry, but he didn't linger either. His gaze kept finding the inn, and in the quiet of the morning, he allowed himself a glance toward the window where he had seen Mara last night. She moved with care, cautious and deliberate, and it made him pause. He knew her kind of caution. He had seen it before, on the faces of women who had been hurt too many times. Mara slipped out of the inn, moving quietly to the boardwalk. Her boots scuffed softly against the worn wood, and she kept her head down. She didn't want attention. But Rusted Hollow had its way of noticing newcomers, and as she walked past the saloon, a few townsfolk glanced her way. Whispers trailed behind her like smoke. Who is she? New in town. Mara ignored them, tightening her grip on her bag. She didn't expect anyone to follow, but Jonas was there again, walking on the opposite side of the street. He didn't speak, didn't make a sudden move. He simply matched her pace with enough distance to be invisible if she chose to ignore him. Mara sensed him immediately. She didn't look up. She didn't want to. She couldn't. Yet, the faintest awareness made her steps a fraction lighter, even as tension twisted in her chest. The market square was noisy now. Horses stamped in their stalls, and the smell of hay and fresh bread filled the air. Mara moved among the townsfolk, careful not to touch anyone. Her eyes scanned every face, every hand. She was alert for danger, and in Rusted Hollow, danger came easily. She paused at a cart of vegetables, pretending to inspect the produce while listening to the quiet shuffle of movement behind her. A sudden commotion drew her attention. A rider, dressed in black, rode fast through the square, yelling something she couldn't catch. People scattered. Mara instinctively stepped back, her hand on the strap of her bag. The rider stopped near the edge of town, speaking to a man in a long coat, Silas Rourke. She had heard whispers of his cruelty before even arriving. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and Mara felt a chill she hadn't expected. This was the reason she had stayed quiet, stayed invisible. Some things couldn't be ignored, no matter how fast you ran. Jonas, who had followed at a distance, stiffened. His jaw clenched. Silas Rourke's name was enough to warn him. He had known the kind of man Silas was, and he knew Mara was already too close to trouble without realizing it. He stepped out into the street, keeping his movements calm, but his eyes never left Mara. Mara didn't notice him yet. She was focused on the rider, on the man in black who moved like a predator among the townsfolk. Her heart beat faster, but she forced her expression to stay neutral. She had survived worse, she told herself, though her hands trembled slightly. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of hooves and distant shouts. Mara looked up, finally meeting Jonas's gaze across the square. There was no question in his eyes, no judgment. Only quiet awareness. She wanted to look away, to disappear, but she couldn't. The black rider turned, spurring his horse toward the far end of the street. Mara instinctively followed with her eyes. Jonas mirrored her movement, keeping his distance, silent, patient, protective. The moment stretched, and for the first time since arriving, Mara felt the weight of someone watching her, not to control her, but to wait for her choice. The wind blew dust along the boardwalk, carrying the smell of dry earth and horses. Mara backed away slowly, keeping the crowd between her and the black rider. Jonas stayed in the shadows, watching her every move, ready, yet restrained. The morning light was harsh and unforgiving, casting long shadows that fell across the square. Mara realized then that Rusted Hollow was not just a town. It was a test. And she had just stepped onto the first path. She could not walk alone. By midday, Rusted Hollow's dusty streets were crowded with townsfolk, wagons, and horses. Mara stayed close to the shadows of the buildings, her eyes scanning every alley. She had hoped to remain invisible, but the town had a way of drawing attention, whether she liked it or not. Her steps were careful, deliberate. Every creak of a board, every clatter of hooves made her flinch. As she rounded the corner by the old sawmill, Mara froze. Voices carried on the wind, low, urgent, and dangerous. She pressed herself against the wall, peeking around the corner. A group of men, dressed in rough black coats, was gathered around a man lying on the ground. The man groaned, clutching his side, blood dark against the dirt. Mara's stomach twisted. Her breath caught. One of the men stepped forward, a paper in his hand. He waved it over the wounded man. "This will secure it. The land will be ours," he said, voice low and cold. Mara recognized the words, the tone. These were men working for Silas Rourke. They were forging deeds, killing anyone who stood in their way. Her heart pounded as the pieces clicked together. She had walked into something far worse than she imagined. Her instinct screamed at her to run. She wanted to vanish, to disappear into the alley behind her. But she couldn't look away. Her eyes locked on the man. He was barely moving, barely breathing. Mara realized she had just become a witness to a murder that could destroy her if anyone discovered she had seen it. From across the street, she saw Jonas. He had followed, of course, though silently, always a step behind. He paused, taking in the scene without rushing in. His eyes found hers briefly, a silent warning. She nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if to say she understood. She needed him, but she couldn't ask for help yet. Not openly. Not when her trust was still fragile. The men finished with the papers, leaving the injured man behind, crawling weakly toward the edge of the sawmill. Mara's stomach churned. She had to move. She ducked further into the shadows, every step measured. The wind caught her hair, brushing her face like a whisper, as if urging her to keep going. Her mind raced. Where could she hide? How could she survive? Jonas shifted closer, staying just out of sight of the men. He didn't interfere, but his presence gave her courage. It was enough to remind her that she wasn't entirely alone. Still, the danger was real. Silas's men would be looking for any witnesses. And she had seen too much. Mara's chest tightened with fear. She had run from men before, from control, from pain. But this was different. This could follow her forever. A horse whinnied in the distance, making Mara flinch. She moved quickly, hugging the shadows, her boots barely making a sound. She ducked behind a stack of lumber, trying to make herself small, invisible. The heat of the day pressed down on her, and sweat ran into her eyes. Her hands shook. She had survived so much, yet the terror here felt sharper, more immediate. Jonas's voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried clearly. "You can't stay here. Come with me." Mara didn't move at first. She wasn't ready. Trust was slow for her. But she felt the pull of his patience, the steady strength behind him. She nodded slightly, and together they slipped through the back streets, away from the sawmill and the men who had already made one person pay with his life. As they moved, Mara's thoughts raced. Her past, the forced marriage, the betrayal, the fear, pressed against her mind like a tide. She had fled to Rusted Hollow for safety, but she realized that safety was an illusion. Silas Rourke's men didn't care about fear or innocence. They only cared about power and control. The wind picked up again, carrying the smell of dry grass and dust. Mara kept her eyes on the horizon, where the hills rolled in long, golden shadows. Jonas stayed beside her, silent, protective. She didn't ask him questions. She didn't explain herself. She simply moved, step by cautious step, into the unknown, knowing that running alone would not save her. The town behind them buzzed with normal life, unaware of the danger lurking, unaware of the witness who now carried the knowledge of Silas Rourke's deadly plans. Mara's heart raced, but a strange, flickering thought took root. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face this alone. By late afternoon, Mara and Jonas had reached the edge of town, where a narrow trail led toward the hills. The wind had picked up, whipping dust across the road and tugging at their coats. Mara's boots slipped occasionally on loose gravel, but Jonas moved beside her with steady, patient steps. He didn't speak unless necessary, letting her set the pace. That silence, strange as it was, felt safer than words. They reached a small, abandoned cabin tucked behind a clump of cedar trees. Its windows were dusty, and the door hung slightly off its hinges. Jonas pushed it open carefully, and Mara stepped inside, surveying the sparse space. Old straw covered the floor in one corner, and a small stove sat cold against the wall. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Mara's chest tightened as she realized how desperately she needed a place to hide. Jonas lowered his bag onto the floor, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "We'll be safe here for a while," he said softly. His voice wasn't commanding, it was patient, steady. Mara's eyes flicked to him, wary. She didn't trust easily, not after everything. Yet, there was a difference with Jonas. He didn't push, didn't demand. He simply waited. Mara set her bag down and unfastened her scarf, letting the fabric fall away. She ran her hands through her hair, tension rolling off her shoulders in small bursts. She kept glancing at Jonas, unsure if she wanted to speak, unsure if she could. The cabin smelled of dust and old wood, but the quiet inside felt protective, almost sacred. Jonas moved to the stove and knelt, checking that it was safe. "We'll need firewood," he said. He didn't ask, he didn't insist. He simply began gathering small branches from the corner. Mara watched him, noticing the careful way he handled each stick, the deliberate calm in his eyes. It was strange to feel the tension in her chest ease, even if just a little. "I've seen things," Mara finally said, her voice low and guarded. She didn't look at him directly, only at the floorboards. "Things I shouldn't have seen." Her hands clenched at her sides. "I thought I could run from them, but," her voice faltered. Jonas didn't interrupt. He waited, letting her choose her words. When she paused, he said softly, "Then you'll need a place to rest. To think. To plan. You won't have to do it alone." Mara swallowed hard. The idea of depending on someone made her stomach knot. She had spent years running from control, from men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. And yet, Jonas wasn't like them. He didn't demand, didn't push. He waited. And in that waiting, he offered her something she hadn't felt in a long time: choice. The wind rattled the cabin walls, carrying the sound of distant hooves and the town beyond. Mara moved to the window, peering through the dusty glass. Her mind raced with possibilities, threats, and plans. Silas Rourke would come looking. His men would follow any trace, any clue that might lead them to her. Mara clenched her fists, feeling the familiar fear coil in her chest. But for the first time, she had someone beside her who wouldn't let that fear alone decide her fate. Jonas noticed her tension and stepped closer, though still giving her space. He didn't touch her, didn't ask. "We'll face it together," he said simply. There was no bravado in his voice, no false promise. Just steady presence, patience, and protection. Mara sank onto the straw in the corner, exhausted. The day had drained her, but the adrenaline kept her awake. She thought of the man lying wounded in the sawmill, of the black-coated riders, of the danger that waited. And yet, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. Jonas set a small fire in the stove, the flames crackling softly. The light danced across Mara's face, illuminating the tension, the scars, and the careful strength she carried. She didn't speak again, but she didn't need to. The silence between them was enough. He would wait. She could rest, just for a while, without fear. Outside, the wind carried dust and the faint sounds of rusted hollow into the hills. Inside, the cabin held a quiet warmth, a fragile safety. Mara's eyes closed for a moment, and the first sigh of relief in weeks escaped her lips. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, she had a place to hide and a man who waited, not for her to surrender but for her to choose. The next morning, the hills glowed golden as sunlight stretched across the valleys. Mara sat outside the cabin, her knees drawn close, staring at the distant town. She could see rusted hollow's main street, the thin plumes of smoke from chimneys, and the slow movement of people going about their lives. It all looked peaceful, but she knew better. Danger moved quietly, hidden behind ordinary faces. Jonas sat a few feet away, sharpening a knife. He didn't rush, didn't talk unless necessary. Mara watched him, noticing the calm precision in his movements. For hours, they stayed in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Mara's chest still felt tight with fear, but the quiet of the hills, the warmth of the morning, made it easier to breathe. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I didn't just run from men. I ran from the life they tried to force on me. I was married once. I didn't choose it. Her voice faltered, and she pressed her palms to her knees. I swore I'd never be trapped again." Jonas nodded slowly, not saying a word. His eyes held understanding, not pity. "You choose your life now," he said simply. "No one else decides it for you." His words were steady, gentle, and something in Mara's chest shifted. She didn't know trust yet, but she felt the weight of it beginning to form, a tiny spark in the dark. A sudden noise carried across the hills, a rider's hooves pounding against the dirt. Mara stiffened. She had hoped for peace, even briefly, but the world of rusted hollow never allowed it. Jonas was already moving, scanning the horizon. The rider slowed as he approached the cabin. Mara crouched, holding her bag close, her heart pounding. The rider stopped at the edge of the trees. Jonas stepped forward, hands calm but ready. The man removed his hat, revealing a scarred face. "Silas Rourke sent me," he said, voice low and harsh. "He knows someone saw what happened at the sawmill." Mara's stomach sank. It wasn't just danger anymore, it was personal. Silas had identified her as the threat, the witness who could ruin his plans. She had no weapon, no allies in town, only Jonas, and the small cabin behind the hills. Her pulse raced. Jonas moved closer, shielding her with his broad frame. "You're not alone," he said. The rider's eyes flicked toward Mara, calculating, before he backed off slowly. Jonas didn't follow. He waited until the man disappeared over the ridge, then turned to Mara. "You have to be careful," he said quietly. "He won't stop. Silas doesn't forgive witnesses. He controls the town, and he'll use everything he can to get to you." Mara clenched her fists, a mixture of fear and anger rising. "Then I won't run anymore," she said. Her voice was steady, firm. "I can't keep hiding. He won't stop, and I won't let him win." Jonas nodded, as if he had expected her to say that. He didn't question, didn't argue. He only adjusted his stance, a silent promise that he would be there. Mara noticed the way his eyes never left hers, the patience in his posture. It wasn't forced. It wasn't pressure. It was support, steady and unshakable. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying dust and the faint sounds of rusted hollow. Mara took a deep breath, letting the sharp air fill her lungs. She felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. For the first time since the sawmill, she felt the sense of possibility, of fighting back, of facing Silas rather than hiding. Hours passed as they prepared the cabin. Mara gathered firewood, Jonas reinforced the door, and boarded up a window. Each movement was deliberate, necessary. The quiet companionship between them grew, unspoken but powerful. Mara began to realize that trust didn't have to be earned all at once. It could begin with a single gesture, a single promise kept. As the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky in orange and pink, Mara stood at the doorway, looking toward Rusted Hollow. She didn't know how the town would react if she returned, how Silas would strike next. But she felt something new stirring inside, a courage that came from knowing someone believed in her, someone waited for her, not to demand her choice, but to honor it. Jonas joined her at the doorway. Neither spoke. They simply watched the horizon together, the wind carrying dust and whispers of the town below. Mara knew the danger was far from over, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it, not as a frightened girl, but as someone who had the strength to stand. The next evening, the cabin sat in quiet shadow. The sun had dipped behind the hills, leaving long streaks of orange and purple across the sky. Inside, Mara sat by the small stove, staring at the faint flicker of the last embers. Her hands were wrapped around a tin cup, warm but empty of tea. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying distant sounds from Rusted Hollow, hooves, doors, and the low hum of life moving on unaware. Jonas leaned against the doorway, his silhouette outlined by the last light. He watched her quietly, giving her space, his presence steady like the hills themselves. Mara felt it, a calm weight, but she didn't turn to meet his eyes. She wasn't ready yet. Trust didn't come easy. It was fragile, like dry wood waiting for a spark. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and almost hesitant. I think I can trust you." The words hung in the air between them. Mara's eyes didn't leave the fire. She didn't want to see if hope would betray her. She had been hurt before, by men who promised safety and delivered pain. Trust was dangerous. But Jonas, he was different. She felt it, though she didn't fully understand why. Jonas stepped closer, keeping a respectful distance. His voice was quiet but firm. "Trust takes time. You can't rush it." He paused, letting his words settle. "I'll wait. I'll wait however long it takes." Mara's chest tightened. The simplicity of his words struck her harder than any promise or plea could. "But I can't let anyone close," she whispered. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her scarf. "Not again. Not ever." Her voice broke slightly, and she looked away, ashamed of her weakness. Jonas didn't move closer. He didn't try to touch her or persuade her. He simply nodded. "Then I'll wait until you are," he said softly, eyes steady, full of quiet patience. His words weren't a demand or a claim. They weren't a test. They were a promise that she would decide the pace, that her choice mattered. Mara swallowed hard. For the first time in years, someone had spoken not to control her, but to honor her boundaries. Her chest ached with relief, fear, and something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time, hope. She let her hands rest on her knees, letting the tension in her body ease, just slightly. The wind picked up outside, rattling the loose boards of the cabin, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and dust from Rusted Hollow. Mara's mind raced with memories, forced promises, betrayal, the nights she had spent hiding, trembling. And yet, in that quiet cabin, with Jonas waiting patiently, she felt the weight of those memories lighten, if only a little. Hours passed. Mara spoke in small fragments, telling Jonas pieces of her past she had never shared aloud. The forced marriage, the betrayal, the fear that had driven her from town to town, always hiding. Jonas listened without interruption, without judgment, simply present. Each word she shared was a brick removed from the walls she had built around herself. When she paused, exhausted, Jonas finally said, "You don't have to go back to the world alone. Not now. Not ever." Mara's eyes met his for a brief second. No words came, only understanding. She realized she didn't have to face everything by herself, that trust could begin slowly, with patience and care, not demands and force. Outside, the sun had vanished completely, leaving the sky dark and filled with stars. The wind softened, carrying the quiet sound of leaves brushing against each other. Mara leaned back against the wall, letting the first sense of safety in months fill her chest. Jonas remained in the doorway, silent, watching, waiting. For the first time since Rusted Hollow, Mara allowed herself to breathe freely. Not because she felt entirely safe, not because the danger had passed, but because she knew someone would wait for her, without rush, without force, without judgment. And that knowledge, fragile as it was, gave her strength. The night stretched on, quiet and tender. Mara closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the soft crackle of the last embers, feeling the wind carry the distant sounds of town, and letting the weight of trust settle gently over her heart. The next morning, the hills were shrouded in pale mist. Mara woke to the soft sound of birds, but the peace was fleeting. Jonas had already been outside, checking the perimeter of the cabin. He returned with a serious expression, eyes scanning the horizon. Mara sensed the change immediately. Danger had come closer. "Silas Rourke knows you're hiding," Jonas said quietly, handing her a cup of water. His tone was calm, but Mara felt the weight behind it. "He won't stop, Mara. He never does." Mara nodded, her jaw tight. She had suspected as much. Silas's men were clever and ruthless. He would use anyone, anything, to get to her. The thought of running again made her chest tighten, but she refused to show it. She had fought to survive, and she wasn't about to start hiding now. A sudden shout echoed from the town below. Mara's heart jumped. Jonas moved immediately, his hand on the hilt of his knife. "Stay inside," he warned, though Mara didn't move. She followed him anyway, ready to face what came next. The commotion grew. A small group of townsfolk gathered near the edge of the square, whispering urgently. Mara caught sight of a familiar figure, a young girl, the orphan she had been teaching in the town's small schoolhouse. The girl's eyes were wide, terrified, as two men dragged her toward a waiting horse. Mara's stomach twisted. "She's using her as bait," Jonas said quietly, his voice tight with anger. Mara felt her pulse quicken. Silas had crossed a line. This was no longer about hiding or surviving. Now it was about saving someone else from his cruelty. They moved quickly, descending the trail toward the town. Mara's hands trembled, but her resolve hardened. She had a chance to fight, to protect, and she wouldn't let fear control her this time. Jonas stayed close, his movements calm and measured, guiding her without force. As they reached the edge of the street, they could see Silas's men holding the girl by the horse. Mara's eyes narrowed. She recognized their faces from the sawmill, the same men who had killed the surveyor. Her mind raced. They were strong, dangerous, and there were too many of them for her to fight alone. But Jonas didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his presence commanding yet restrained. "Let her go," he called, his voice carrying over the street. There was no threat, no plea, only authority. The men laughed, thinking the cowboy alone couldn't stop them. Mara's heart pounded, but she stayed hidden just behind Jonas. Silas's voice carried next, cold and sharp. "Bring her here. She knows too much." Mara's stomach sank. The young girl whimpered, and Mara's chest clenched. She couldn't let this happen. Jonas glanced at her briefly. His eyes were steady, reassuring. Mara took a deep breath, drawing on the courage she hadn't realized she still possessed. Together, they moved. Jonas distracted the men with a quick, precise strike to one shoulder, giving Mara the opening she needed. She dashed forward, grabbing the girl's hand, pulling her back toward the shadows of an alley. The men shouted, giving chase, but Mara ran with Jonas close behind. Dust and wind whipped through the streets, carrying the sounds of shouts and hoofbeats. Mara's heart raced, but she focused only on the girl's safety. Her fear was still there, but it had sharpened into determination. They ducked through narrow alleys, the girl clinging tightly to Mara's side. Jonas guided them, silently calculating their route. Finally, they reached a hidden corner near the old sawmill. Mara collapsed against the wall, holding the girl close, listening to the distant chaos fade. Jonas leaned against the other side, keeping watch. "Silas won't stop," he said softly, "but neither will we." Mara nodded, her chest heaving. She realized then that she was no longer just a survivor. She had become a fighter, willing to stand, willing to protect, and willing to trust someone who waited for her without demanding her surrender. The wind carried the scent of dust and smoke, the town below oblivious to the quiet victory in the alleys. Mara looked at the girl, then at Jonas, and felt a flicker of hope. They weren't free yet, but for the first time, she believed they could face whatever came next, together. The next morning, Rusted Hollow seemed unchanged, quiet in the soft light of dawn. But Mara knew better. Silas Rourke's shadow still stretched over the town, even if his men were scattered for now. She stood beside Jonas at the edge of the hills, the young girl safely behind them, watching the town wake. Dust rose from the streets, carried by the morning wind, catching the sunlight like tiny sparks. "We have to end this," Mara said quietly, her voice steady. Her hands were clenched, not with fear, but determination. Jonas nodded. He didn't rush, didn't argue. He simply adjusted the brim of his hat, letting Mara take the lead. They moved into town together, careful, deliberate. Mara kept her gaze forward, steady. She knew Silas's men would notice her, but Jonas's presence gave her courage. They reached the town square, where murmurs had begun to spread. Silas stood there, arrogant and cruel, flanked by his men. His eyes narrowed as he spotted Mara and the girl. "You again," he snarled. "You've caused enough trouble." Mara stepped forward, her voice clear, unwavering. "It's over, Silas. The townsfolk know what you've done. Your lies, your killings, it ends today." Silas laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "And who will stop me?" "You. A girl and a cowboy?" Jonas stepped beside Mara, his presence calm but undeniable. "We will," he said simply. There was no threat, no boast, only certainty. Mara felt the strength in those words, in him. The townsfolk, who had watched from windows and doorways, began to gather. One by one, they stepped forward, bringing proof, documents, and testimony. Silas's smug expression faltered. The evidence of his forgeries and crimes was undeniable. The town, long afraid, found its courage. Silas roared in fury, but it was too late. The sheriff, backed by the townspeople, stepped forward. "You're under arrest, Silas Rourke," he said firmly. The black-coated men tried to resist, but the strength of the town was greater than their fear. Silas's empire of terror crumbled in the morning light. Mara watched silently as he was taken away. Her heart was still racing, but it was not fear this time. Relief mixed with something warmer, pride, perhaps, that she had survived, that she had fought, and that she had helped bring justice. Jonas stood beside her, his eyes calm, patient, unwavering. Mara turned to him, and for the first time, she felt she could truly see him, not just as a protector, but as someone who had waited without demanding, who had believed in her before she could believe in herself. She stepped closer, her hand reaching for his. Jonas didn't move to meet it, he simply waited, letting her choice come freely. Mara's fingers curled around his hand, and she felt the weight of her past begin to lift. She didn't need anyone to save her. She had chosen her trust, her courage, her path. And now, she chose him. The wind carried dust and sunlight across Rusted Hollow, painting long shadows and golden highlights across the street. Mara and Jonas stood together, the girl safely at their side, and the town behind them filled with a new hope. The danger had passed, but more importantly, the town had reclaimed its strength, and Mara had reclaimed herself. She looked at Jonas, her eyes steady, and whispered, almost to herself, "I'm ready." Jonas's lips curved into the faintest smile. No words were needed beyond that. The quiet strength between them spoke of patience, trust, and the possibility of a future built on understanding rather than fear. The sun rose higher, illuminating Rusted Hollow in warm light. Dust swirled gently in the morning breeze, carrying the scent of freedom, hope, and new beginnings. Mara stepped forward with Jonas, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next, together, as equals, and with hearts unburdened by the past. The town seemed to hold its breath, then exhaled, and life in Rusted Hollow moved forward, quiet, steady, and full of promise. The horizon stretched wide, endless, and open, and Mara finally felt the weight of her fear lift completely.